Our sole purpose is to get the federal government to take the actions that we have demanded that they take.
We must hold our Congress accountable.
Why is this a problem?
I came here to be free.
So if we don't like the money that the government coins, we can coin our own.
How much longer are we willing to allow this tyrant government to kill our fellow man before we have the intestinal fortitude to stand up and tell them we're not going to take it any longer?
Down in the dirt, patriotic, I'm tired of this government crap that you're feeding me.
The only war that I will fight in is the one that is brought to my soil.
The American people have a right to be left alone.
We continue to fund the police state. We will continue to be abused by it.
I want the words in this to make people sit down and think.
And if we do not act strong now, we may never get another chance.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. As we look around, it is clear that all men are not treated equally. And unfortunately, that's because of an error in understanding in that sentence. Self-evident. Today, we would probably call that obvious. Unfortunately, there is nothing obvious. You and I would never put our hand on a stove as we walk through the kitchen because we know there's a possibility the stove would be hot. But to a child trying to find out what mother is cooking, hot is not obvious. Hot is not obvious until you have experienced your first blisters. As sad as it is, liberty should be self-evident. Liberty is obvious to us, but we make a mistake if we assume that liberty and the principles therein are obvious to all of our fellow Americans. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So if your rights are unalienable, they are rights which cannot have conditions put on them. You have freedom of religion, not freedom of religion if you are Jewish, Catholic, or Protestant. You have a right to keep and bear arms to protect your life and the lives of your family, not you have a right to keep and bear arms as long as it's not an assault rifle or a Saturday night special or doesn't use cop killer bullets. Your rights are unalienable. They are individual rights. They are not constitutional rights. The Constitution nor the Bill of Rights grant you nothing. You have those rights in spite of those pieces of paper. We do have a Constitution, we do have a Bill of Rights, but we do not have a government that respects those rights. When a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the Homegrown Terrorism Act, and the trillion-dollar bailouts and stimulus packages, if these do not constitute a long train of abuses pursuing invariably the same object, I don't know what it would require. What would our government have to do before people in the United States realize that this is not the reason the Founding Fathers established our constitutional republic? It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Not only do we have a right to protect ourselves from a government out of control, we have a moral obligation to do so. We, the people, ordain and establish the Constitution. We, the people, created Congress. They work for us. They are out of control because our parents and grandparents and previous generations have allowed the government to get out of control. Fortunately, we are here. We are now, and we will, in this process of the Continental Congress, begin providing for new guards for our future security. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. We stand here in the same political position that our founding fathers did before they wrote and signed the Declaration of Independence. They were not happy about taxation without representation. They were not happy with many of the laws that were being passed in the colonies. And all of those things had them irritated. But the one thing that kind of topped the whole list is the fact that the king refused to listen to their petitions. There was no negotiation. There was no give and take. There was no communication between the colonies and the crown. We stand here ready to demand a response. They work for us. That liberty is not my highest priority. Liberty is my only priority. Most of what our government does is unconstitutional. I find that unconscionable and totally unacceptable. Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1 of the Constitution says, all legislative powers herein granted. We, the people, have individual rights, and we grant the government privileges. And we have the power and authority to remove those privileges anytime we feel the need and the courage to do so. The delegates of this Continental Congress do not fear the government. The Founding Fathers were not extraordinary men. They were ordinary men doing extraordinary things. We have an opportunity and a duty to achieve something extraordinary during this historic gathering. The world is watching. Your fellow Americans are depending on you.
It was but one sentence, and it promised us that we were a free people. It guaranteed to us freedom of religion, freedom of speech, a free press, the right to assemble together, and the unequivocal right to petition the government for redress of grievances. It remains the single most important sentence in the history of our country. That sentence reminds us of who we are. And if anything should be memorized and chanted in public, it should be that pledge, the pledge from our founders. The last 10 words of the First Amendment have been stolen from us by our servant government. We, the people, brought the first legal action in our country's history to enforce the promise of the First Amendment set forth in the capstone segment of that amendment. The government has no obligation to respond to any petition. That's what they wrote in court. In fact, the government is not even required to read any petition, no matter how serious the matter and how properly and respectfully the petition was submitted. We appealed to the second highest court in the country, the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. The only court above that is the United States Supreme Court. We appealed, and on May 8th, 2007, in case number 055359, the court agreed unanimously that the First Amendment does not impose any affirmative obligation upon the government to listen to or respond to or even to read any petition. And thus the court abolished the petition clause of the First Amendment. It's still being printed, but that's the way it should be published now. In this case, the Supreme Court refused to review the case, likely and ironically in part due to the unanimous decision of the lower court. If the judge who expressed interest in how the Supreme Court might consider the issues, if she matched courage with her curiosity, the result might have been different. The First Amendment served us for long and honorably. It is now our time, our responsibility to acknowledge our debt to it and to seek to protect it. It was not created by the founders as a psychological and meaningless feel-good methods of venting frustrations, but rather to guarantee to us the right to redress grievances and to hold the servant government accountable to us for its wrongful acts. It was meant to be strong medicine for the body politic. It was not designed as a useless placebo. The petition was likely the most thorough petition, the most documented petition, the most nationally represented petition ever presented to the government and all of its branches. It comprised almost a decade-long effort to obtain answers to charges that the government had violated the laws regarding our war powers, money, and privacy and tax clauses established by the Constitution. The case is a first impression case, which means that the issue has never before been presented to the court. It's less challenging to stand by precedent and not disturb a settled point of law than it is to make new law. Unable to find precedent, they distorted previous rulings, hoping that the court would not notice, or more likely, would not care. The Department of Justice is not the government. We are the government, and they work for us. The court offered this statement, the Court of Appeals. The petition clause, by its rights, refers only to a right to petition. It does not also refer to a right to a response or official consideration. That's an absurd and meritless argument, and it's far too reaching to be considered seriously. All rights are by their nature enforceable. If they are not enforceable, then they are not rights. No doubt the court considered not the law, but rather the consequences of its decision. How else can you explain such outrageous rulings except to say they had something else in their mind? What do they have in their mind? This country is much larger than it was 200 years ago, or even a century ago. And antiquated notions about people journeying to the nation's capital on foot or by horseback for days or weeks, petition in hand, may have perplexed them when translated into our present complicated society. Maybe that's what they were concerned about. Yes, Congress had set aside days when people would come, and they came by horseback or came by carriage, carrying their petitions. This is a different world now. There has been in large measure a deafening silence regarding the destruction of the petition clause of the First Amendment. Before you, delegates from the various states at this Continental Congress, is the question of how we restore our rights under the First Amendment. The founders will not sit among us, but their inspiration is with us. In addition, there is Bob Schultz, who through innovation, energy, and perseverance is reminiscent of them. The words of your predecessor, Paul Revere. I set off on a very good horse. It was then 11 o'clock and very pleasant. I said we had better alarm all of the inhabitants. Well, you are the Paul Revere Brigade for the restoration of the First Amendment. I welcome you here to your Continental Congress and remind you that it is again 11 o'clock.
As a delegate, I came to defend, not amend, the Constitution. The First Amendment to the Constitution reads as follows: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Various clauses in this amendment have been given labels, not by the framers, but by interpreters. These clause labels are then assigned specific meanings, and we essentially are told by the interpreters that such clauses actually exist and must be adhered to. One such clause is the so-called accountability clause. To say there was an accountability clause is to virtually amend the First Amendment to read, when in receipt of such petition, Congress shall respond to grievances from whatever petitioners shall so petition. With this interpretation, the First Amendment is no longer only restrictive, stating what Congress may not do. It now says what Congress must do. With this interpretation added, any mob that petitioned Congress would be in control. As much as I would desire that the Congress be a genie and grant my every wish, I cannot suggest that this was the intent of the founders. This is not constitutional, it is interpretive. Do we want a constitution that is directly understandable according to the words written, or do we want one that is what the judges or other interpreters say it is? I am not willing to sacrifice integrity on the altar of expediency because I want something done in a hurry, or just because I might desire to make Congress accountable to me or even a group of us. I vote no to any change by interpretation to the words of the First Amendment.
Edward Vieira is a constitutional expert par excellence. He is a great legal mind. He prepared some documents. These are not resolutions. These are, if more than anything else, kind of a lecture, kind of an instructional thing to give you some ideas as you move forward with these issues. Reassertion of the power of the purse. Petition number 1A, directed to Congress. A, that the Congress of the United States, in the exercise of its power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, shall enact a statute, 1, establishing a National Advisory Commission on alternative and competitive currency, and 2, calling upon each of the several states to establish her own state advisory commission on alternative and competitive currency. The National Advisory Commission shall submit to Congress a report containing complete and specific drafts of all such legislation as may be necessary and proper for Congress to enact in order to guarantee that the citizens of each state may employ an alternative and competitive currency in all of their private economic transactions, free from any form of taxation, reporting, or other regulation by the United States or any agency thereof. The declaration that all unconstitutionally incurred alleged public debt of the United States is void and enforcement thereof. In the exercise of its power to borrow money on the credit of the United States and to enforce by appropriate legislation the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, as those terms are used in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, shall enact a statute establishing a National Advisory Commission to review the constitutional status of the alleged public debt of the United States. That the sole purpose of the National Advisory Commission will be to study the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law and to recommend the means by which the United States can and should identify and declare as void or voidable all of the outstanding alleged public debts of the United States that have been incurred by unconstitutional means or for unconstitutional purposes. If a lender extends a loan to public officials knowing that his loan will be used for unconstitutional purposes or with willful blindness to a reckless disregard of the unconstitutionality of those purposes, He is thereby a participant in a fraud against the American people, and for the repayment of such a loan, the American people cannot be held liable.
In theory, the law is a check on tyranny or the arbitrary use of power. We have law. But what happens if law itself becomes a tool of tyranny? Regulatory agencies may have very nice, fuzzy, nice-sounding goals for the rest of us. They may pursue financial stability or investor protection. But the regulatory agencies themselves, and this is the University of Chicago's take, is that ultimately they end up getting captured by the industries they regulate. And to what extent they use these goals cynically to create benefits for special interest groups at the expense of the general welfare. Goals in financial regulation, and specifically at the Federal Reserve, is to avoid something called systemic risk. The failure of one bank can lead to the failure of another, to another, to another. And it can be a real threat. But one of the questions is whether or not some of the government solutions that we have to restrain systemic risk actually end up causing systemic risk. It's very ironic, I think, that we're getting a lesson about moral hazard from an insurance company. People realize in the insurance world, if I extend an insurance policy to you, there's an incentive maybe to take more risk than you otherwise would have taken, or actually cause the loss that's being insured against. Well, you and I and everyone else in America have decided to support our financial system by providing a variety of different guarantees or insurance mechanisms for the banking system. That we did a poor job. You and I have responsibilities, as well as Congress, as well as the regulators, of monitoring and pricing the risk that was being taken in the financial system. You and I are behind the system in the long run. We're the ones that take the losses. And that's kind of what happened. It's very sad what happened in the financial crisis, and I hope we're learning our lesson. If you go back and look at the words of the Trading with the Enemy Act, which we still have in our books today, which was developed in 1917, it's amazing. I used to think that I lived in a free market or a free society. And during a time of war, the president can do anything he wants to anybody in the banking system. It's almost what, you read, I don't want to overstate, but the degree of arbitrary authority that's available in this legislation. And in turn, the Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1934 and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, I think, of 77. Some of the stuff is very interesting to look at, and just read it in the bald face of the language. Is the grant of authority that it's given to our executive branch in the financial markets during either A, a time of war, or B, FDR's declaration of the bank holiday in 1933 was citing the Trading with the Enemy Act, which was available during a time of war. Given that the Fed if it is constitutional, it's a creature of Congress, and it's a very interesting constitutional powers issue, whether or not the executive or the Congress is calling the shots during a time of strife or a time of crisis in the financial markets. I wrote a primer on money laundering, and I noticed a couple of things when I started writing this primer, including two things. On August 2nd, 2001, the Board of Governors issued a letter to the reserve banks urging them to scrutinize their suspicious activity reports. These are reports that banks and other institutions are required to file in the event of suspected criminal activity with financial transactions. That letter didn't mention terrorism or its financing, but it was in 2003 when I noticed this letter, and also became aware of the possibility of intelligence warnings. Well, we've learned a great deal more of the extent of the intelligence warnings that were being received in July and August 2001 than we did at the time I asked my question. Well, if you look at you've heard about M1, M2, M3, the monetary aggregates. Within M1, the narrowest is this stuff, currency circulating outside of banks. Three fastest growing months in the currency component of M1 since World War II, at the time I saw this data, the single fastest was December 1999. Makes some sense, right before Y2K. The second fastest was January 1991. Instead of U.S. military action, and there's some interesting ways, and we've learned more about the use of currency in covert operations, both in Iraq as well as Afghanistan. That's one possible explanation. The second is that there was an important enforcement month in the BCCI scandal. You've heard of the BCCI scandal, money laundering scandal? That was an important, I'm curious if either one of those factors were operating in January 1991. And the third fastest growing month since World War II, out of 700 months or so, was August 2001. It may be completely innocently explained. It may be. there was a banking crisis that was flowering in Argentina. And widows and orphans looking for billions of dollars, and that's what we're talking about, billions of dollars, $100 bills, may be responsible for all of it. But there's a few other explanations. And, well, anyway, to make a longer story short, about a week after I asked my question about that supervisory letter, my assignment was terminated and my credentials were canceled. I was told I committed an egregious breach of protocol, calling the board staff in Washington and asking the question, even though I'd been asked to answer it. I'm getting more bullish on the U.S. economy despite all my anger and angst about our government's role and how we got here. And one of the reasons is that I'm hopeful, not necessarily predicting, but hopeful that we do get a fundamental reexamination of our monetary and financial system as a way of, and so for long run, I think, we're going to see recessions have a way of breeding productivity improvement within the private sector. And if we can produce that kind of, we haven't, the financial institutions and their regulators have been insulated from that. And it's possible this time around, the populism and the interest in this area is growing so much that I think we might get something fundamental down the road that could be healthy.
The statement that it authorizes Congress to coin money does not preclude you from coining money. Any one of us can coin money.
We should suggest completely getting out of the banking system and cutting up every credit card, and it just contributes to this debt-based idea of currency.
Any law repugnant to the Constitution is null and void. Is the Federal Reserve repugnant to our Constitution?
That's some very important work that is left to be done in America, and it's not going to be done by those that are politically correct and are seduced by the politics that we have today that is supported by those that believe that government knows best. We have a crisis in America. That crisis was not created by the current administration, but the problem we have is a crisis of identity. Where are we going as American citizens? When you find former President Clinton get up and say that America is on the right track and the only reason that people were protesting is because they want to deny something to poor people, you see that the demagogues in America are running amok and they're not going to stop. And so the question becomes, how can common everyday citizens organize to make sure that we get back to the principles of the Constitution instead of runaway government by runaway spending? And so the challenge that you have is a very somber challenge because we want to do this in a way that does not reduce us to a caricature to where, okay, I see, it's a bunch of white guys in a militia who hate the black president and they're trying to coalesce and make some demonstrations here, all because they're just haters. You see, the thing is, we're going to be flipped out and they're going to try to castigate the process as being anything but what it is. What it is the people have to stand with a faith, a redeeming faith in the goodness and the integrity of the Constitution and the will of the American people, by and large, to uphold and protect that destiny and that future of a constitutional government that protects us with the provisions that it provides, like the First Amendment, like the Second Amendment, and the other amendments composed on the Bill of Rights. We need to fight for that, and if that means going back to a militia type of government, we have to find a way to take the fangs out of that monster that will constantly come up with the media and try to demonize the process by saying that it's something that's un-American or something that's racially motivated. What we have to do is show that the Second Amendment is just as important in the black inner cities and Hispanic inner cities of America as it is in white suburbia. That the Second Amendment protects the lives of black women in black neighborhoods. And so when the black preacher tries to tell you that the Second Amendment is only for white folks, we have to show them. Blacks have always been a useful tool in the game of gun control. At first, they were the reason for gun control. We have to disarm the blacks. And so by disarming the blacks, they disarmed everyone else that they could, the Italians, the Irish, and everyone else. And so then they say, wait a minute. So now in the 21st century, we have legislation that's pending in the U.S. Congress called the Blair-Holt Amendment. The Blair-Holt Amendment, they're exploiting a black youth that was killed by a gangbanger in Chicago, and they're using the fact that you have gangs and drugs and this type of activity in the inner city the fact that blacks engage in those activities as a reason to make it more difficult for every white in America to keep the right to bear arms. And so they use these types of things to keep us divided. They use these types of things so that we have Reverend Jackson and the usual suspects will stand up with a Father Pfleger, and they'll all stand up arm in arm with the mayor of Chicago, and they'll sing, "We Shall Overcome." And in reality, the streets of Chicago are just as violent as they were way, way before they passed any of this gun control nonsense, and the streets are not getting safer by keeping the average everyday citizen disarmed. You have the power to transcend race, to transcend culture, to reach across the aisle, to reach into the neighborhoods and say, look, you've been told something that is not really working in your own best interest. You've been told that keeping guns off the street and demonizing guns is the answer, and that we need to get rid of the Second Amendment altogether. In reality, it's your responsibility as a man in your neighborhood to provide a level of safety like the committees of safety and the militia was designed by the founders. When we get the men in America and the women in America to stand up, not only to protect their own rights, but to protect their own communities by guaranteeing that enough of a quantity will be armed for their own self-protection, then you're going to have more guns and less crime.
Again from Dr. Ed Vieira, reassertion of the power of the sword, that the Congress of the United States, in the exercise of its power to provide for organizing, aiming, and disciplining the militia, shall enact a statute. 1. Establishing a National Advisory Commission on Revitalization of the Militia of the several states, and 2. Calling upon each of the several states to establish her own state advisory commission on revitalization of the state militia. That notwithstanding the foregoing, the said statute provided for in paragraph A shall explicitly recognize the reserved rights and powers of the several states under the Second and 10th Amendments to do as well as other provisions of the Constitution of the United States during the period of time in which the various advisory commissions are performing their work, as well as at all other times to take whatever actions the states may deem appropriate to revitalize their militia on an individual basis, whether as a result of the recommendations of such commissions or otherwise.
Keeping and bearing arms is a natural right.
Let me address why open carry is important. First of all, we need to know what it's not. It's not brash, it's not macho, it's not a threat.
Carrying a firearm on your side is not taboo. It is not taboo. It provides for a much more safe and free society.
All them folks in them other countries didn't exercise their Second Amendment right. The main problem is they don't have a Second Amendment right. And if we're not careful, we're not going to have one either.
And I know some idiots in 1776 that picked up some firearms, and some of them lost their lives. Those are the kind of people we're going to call idiots. Then I will be an idiot, I guess, someday, maybe.
Ignorance is the main component of fear, and fear is the main component of gun control. And gun control is one of the main components of a totalitarian society.
Everybody needs to own a gun, and you can see why. It's coming up. Everybody needs to own a gun. We have our right to, and we need to. Thank you.
The first 3 years of my career in the IRS Criminal Investigation Division were very fulfilling. I conducted high-level income tax and money laundering investigations, sometimes working jointly with the FBI, DEA, Secret Service, and U.S. Marshal Service. DV Kidd commented on many provocative topics, but the most provocative comment involved the federal income tax system. She claimed, to my astonishment, that federal law did not actually require most Americans to file federal income tax returns and pay federal income tax. Upon hearing this, I thought to myself, how dare that woman make such a crazy claim? The only course of action that could help resolve this question for me was to seek out more information, and that's exactly what I did. I should point out that I did not create or generate any evidence or theories about the federal income tax system on my own. Rather, my purpose was to use my investigative training and skills to examine the evidence D.V. Kidd had gathered to support her overall claim that most Americans were not required by law to pay the federal income tax. Week after week and month after month during that 2-year period, I obtained and reviewed more and more evidence that the IRS was intentionally deceiving the public, and even in many cases its own agents, about the income tax obligations of ordinary Americans. I learned that there were many credible, honorable people who had performed research into the true scope and limitations of the federal income tax system. I learned that the IRS targeted these credible, honorable people with special harassment techniques, including classifying them as illegal tax protesters. I learned that the IRS assesses and collects the income tax through deceitful and illegal means, even to the point of manipulating its own internal computer system to achieve a desired result, even if that desired result is not supported by the law as written, that I had a moral, ethical, and legal duty to speak up about the evidence I had gathered of abuses and illegal administration. I prepared a report that summarized the highlights of the evidence I had gathered, indicating that laws were being broken and rights violated. I submitted this report to my IRS superiors, believing that since they were bound by the same oath to support and defend the Constitution that I was, they would recognize some duty to review and comment on the evidence I had accumulated. Alas, my IRS superiors recognized no such duty. They not only refused my request to review my report, but they refused to discuss my concerns about the IRS's alleged illegal activities in any manner whatsoever. In a brief memorandum, my superiors further notified me that I had to be immediately placed on administrative leave and that they would provide me with the necessary paperwork to tender my resignation. Given the limitations on my freedom of speech as an IRS employee, and my fear that the IRS would immediately begin to destroy what had otherwise been a reputable career path, I decided that the best course of action would be to resign from my position at the IRS. I had ample proof that the IRS is illegally taxing our labor as if it were income, and illegally forcing withholding from labor's paychecks, as well as many other violations of our Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable seizures and Fifth Amendment right against due process of law.
Taxing clauses of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect what? Taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Notice 4 different words because they mean 4 different things. In the minds of our founding fathers, basically taxes meant direct taxes. Duties, imposts, and excises were the indirect taxes. Only place in the Constitution something is mentioned twice, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4, no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration. In 1894, Congress passed a federal income tax. I want you to pay close attention to who they intended to tax. Every citizen of the United States, whether residing at home or abroad, and every person residing therein. So what do we know? There's a difference between citizens and persons residing therein. Persons residing therein are resident aliens. And what they wanted to tax was the gains, profit, and income, whether said gains, profits, or income be derived from any kind of property, including rents, interest, dividends, or salaries, or from any profession, trade, employment, or vocation. Please note, not the salary of federal employees, not the wages of people living in the states. Every citizen, whether residing at home or abroad, was to have their personal property taxed, including salaries. That was the intent of Congress. I know a lot of people in the tax movement think, oh no, you can't tax my labor, you can't tax my right to work.
not according to the statutes passed by Congress, and not according to the Constitution. 16th Amendment, the Congress shall have power to do what? Laying taxes on income from where? Any source, without apportionment. And then they say this definition is based upon the 16th Amendment, and the word income is used in its constitutional sense. Eisner versus Macomber defined income for us. Income may be defined as the gain derived from capital and from labor. So, is labor personal property? Key issue in determining whether or not there's gain or not. The property which every man has in his own labor, so he calls it property, as it is the original foundation of all other property, so is the most sacred and inviolable. There's no gain on the amount of money that I'm paid for my labor. There being no gain, there's what? There's no income. If there's no income, there's no what? There's no gross income. If there's no gross income, not only do I not have a requirement to file a return under Section 6012, but I have no tax liability.
Does our government, did we the people, at some point in time, give authority to our government to take 100% of our labor from us? If they can tax it $1, they could tax it $1 million. If they could tax it 1%, they have the authority to tax 100%.
This is the result of an intentional clandestine effort by the government to deprive me and you of our property.
Living under fraud, and folks, that's why we're here. That's why people sent us here.
We're laboring under a misconception, I think, that income taxes is anything other than direct. I can't think of anything more direct than a tax on my wages, my salary, my labor. A child that's born today already has a tax obligation of about $35,000 in borrowed money.
It was only meant to be conducted during times of emergency, when the nation itself was in the peril of existing, not in the common times.
Congress was not to tax or to spend money in a way that favored one section, one state, one faction over another.
We have called for the immediate cessation of any income tax collection in this and all withholdings. And I ask you to consider, are you willing to stop payment to your sons and daughters in Iraq immediately?
And Americans be prepared to withhold their income tax from the government once the above steps of self-defense are in place. Furthermore, without delay, the public is advised to contact their county sheriff, state and federal representatives, and senators demanding this unconstitutional taxation and withholding of earnings be stopped immediately.
Taxes are unconstitutional. You have the right, personally, individually, to decide not to do something.
So Article 2 of the Constitution reads in part that the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America, and in part it reads, no person except a natural-born citizen at the time, or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible for the office of President. I read Judge Surek's decision. He was deciding a case brought by a citizen of Pennsylvania who happened to be an attorney. His name is Phil Berg. Mr. Berg went to court before the election and asked the court to prevent Mr. Obama from holding that office, to support his argument that Mr. Obama was not eligible. Instead, they asked the judge to dismiss the case because Mr. Berg had no standing, that the court had no jurisdiction and Mr. Berg had no standing. And that's what Judge Surek did. We decided to petition Mr. Obama directly by use of an open letter published in the Chicago Tribune. And we simply laid out the facts, summarized the facts that Mr. Berg had included in his case, And we also summarized the adverse consequences that could befall the nation if we had somebody holding that position that was there illegally. And we very respectfully requested Mr. Obama to authorize the Hawaiian officials to provide access to his original birth certificate. That to be a natural-born citizen, both your parents had to be U.S. citizens and you had to be born on U.S. soil, both. So if that's true, then Mr. Obama is not eligible because one of his parents is a Kenyan citizen. There was no response to the open letter. The open letter was described in its content as a petition for redress of this grievance.
Regardless of where Barack Obama was born, he could have been born in the White House, in the Lincoln bedroom. He is still completely illegitimate for U.S. presidency, specifically because he had and still has allegiance to several other nations. At the time Constitution was adopted, the legal treatise, legal dictionary that was widely used and actually quoted in the Constitution is a legal treatise called The Law of Nations by Emer de Vattel. And according to Law of Nations, natural-born citizen is one who was born in the country and whose parents, in plural, both of them, are citizens of the country. At the time Barack Hussein Obama was born, his father, Barack Hussein Obama Sr., was a student. He was on a student visa in the United States of America.
We've never seen or heard President Obama mention the Constitution, but we've sure seen and heard him walk all over it.
So we have to enforce the oath of office.
And I am a believer that it is better to follow a bad law and do everything in your power to get it repealed than to render all law impotent.
The war power under the Constitution is one of the most critical clauses that the framers put in the Constitution, and it reflects what we all hear frequently, and that is that the decision to go to war for any government is probably the most solemn, most important decision that any government could ever make. But what we often do not hear is that the Constitution governs this process in a way that our government fails to follow. For the past half-century, American presidents have been violating the Constitution on a frequent basis. For the past 50 years and more, presidents have been claiming a unilateral presidential power to take the nation into war, and that violates the war clause of the Constitution. That clause provides that Congress shall have power to declare war. For the past half-century, Congress has not been performing its duties and responsibilities in this area, and presidents have been violating the war clause. Now, it's important to note that Hamilton never asserted the idea that the president should have the authority to go to war, not in the Constitutional Convention, nor later in his distinguished career. He made it very clear, crystal clear, that only Congress can make the decision to go to war, and that requires an agreement by both the House and the Senate. In this way, the framers, as I mentioned earlier, implemented the doctrine of checks and balances, the principle of constitutionalism. So coming out of Philadelphia, to sum up then, there was clear agreement that only Congress could make the decision to go to war, that the president's powers would be limited. In his role as commander-in-chief, he would conduct the war once it had been authorized by Congress, either through a formal declaration or through a joint resolution. Or in the alternative, if the nation were attacked, then the president as commander-in-chief would have the duty and the power to repel the invasion. But after the invaders have been driven out, then the Congress would make the decision on the course of our policy. Nobody in the Constitutional Convention ever claimed that the president had a war power. Nobody in the convention or in the state ratifying conventions ever asserted that the president has the authority as commander-in-chief to take the nation into war. No Supreme Court decision in the entire history of the Union has ever said that the president, as commander-in-chief, has authority to take the nation into war. So the reality is, ever since 1950, Congress has stood on the sidelines, unwilling to defend its constitutional power to decide to go to war. It has often acquiesced in the face of presidential usurpation of power by both Republicans and Democrats, I should add. And Congress has become a spectator when it comes to the matter of making these decisions on war and peace. But in that one moment in 1998, Congress stood up for itself and it refused to authorize President Clinton to order bombing. Nevertheless, President Clinton went forward and engaged in the bombing. That marked the first time in the history of the Republic that a president violated a congressional refusal to authorize hostilities. When President Bush indicated that he wanted to retaliate against Iraq, a discussion unfolded in Congress. And Congress decided, through the authorization to use military force, that he would be given the authority to go to war. Under the War Clause, Congress must make the decision whether or not we're going to war. The problem is, and this reflects the congressional acquiescence to presidential power for a half-century, the problem with both resolutions is that Congress failed to make the decision to go to war. Instead, what Congress did in both settings was to say, we will allow President Bush to decide whether we go to war. That marks a failure by Congress to live up to its constitutional duties to make this critical decision. So the men and women in Congress who delegated to the president the choice of whether to go to war in Afghanistan or the choice to go to war in Iraq failed to live up to the high standards established by the framers of the Constitution. In that way, regrettably, Congress has failed, again, to assert its responsibilities and duties. I believe that what we need is for the American people, people like yourselves, to raise their voices in a chorus of criticism demanding governmental adherence to the Constitution. If governmental officials dare to claim, arrogantly claim the authority to disregard the Constitution, then those officials, in the views and language of the Convention and the founding period, are exercising the power of tyrants.
We've lost over 70,000 young Americans to undeclared wars and hundreds of thousands more wounded.
We must hold our Congress accountable for making sure our government follows the Constitution.
Follow the Constitution of the United States. Discontinue funding for any foreign aid or other funding that is not necessary for the defense against invasion of the United States.
That any time a man takes away your right or violates any of your God-given rights, any of them, that he has already declared war upon you.
Today's warfare is not nation against nation, but network against network. It's an information war, and you're all in it right now.
In the event that the United States government were to enact a draft, citizens are encouraged to refuse to participate.
War has become a tool of the congressional despots, the parties, presidential usurpers, and the media. As we have found out that the CIA has funded, supported, and trained the very terrorists and radicals that we now fight and send our brave men and women off to war.
Stand by the Constitution on both foreign and domestic issues. No compromises, none whatsoever.
Going all the way back to the 1500s, it's been very profitable and perhaps maybe the best asset of a central bank is war. They've made all kinds of money over encouraging leaders
to go to war. It's much easier to convince one president to initiate a war than it is an entire Congress.
War costs us a great deal of our hard-earned tax money. The decision to go to war should not be a light one. Yet our past history clearly indicates that our government has taken it quite lightly. We have to impress upon our government that we're not willing to sacrifice our sons and daughters to fight in some foreign war that has very little to do with anything that goes on in our nation.
We are a nation divided. Is there a more divisive issue than war? And it feels like we have been at war for decades. And this is by design.
The framers realized how dangerous it was to allow one man to enter war and fight war. That was the result of decades and centuries of bloodbath in Europe.
The problem was we didn't declare war, and as a consequence, the American people were not behind the action.
I'm disappointed I wasn't actually able to join you, and I'm going to open actually with the story of why I'm not there. I had planned actually to fly in Southwest Airlines and to arrive yesterday afternoon, and then I got a pretty frantic phone call from Judith and Bob and the people making the arrangements saying, Catherine, we're not able to book your flight without your date of birth. And I said, oh gosh, it's finally here. And the here, or the thing that is finally here, is actually a program called Secure Flight. You may have heard about this, but it's one of the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission that in order to make us all safer, they need to begin to really identify who the people are who are flying, all the way down to their date of birth and their gender. I believe that this is step one in what is ultimately going to be a requirement for a biometric identifier on the part of Americans. And so what happens is that rather than the government themselves requiring this information, they have required the airlines to ask this of you. And then the airline is required in advance of your flight to run your name, your date of birth, and your gender past this federal government database. And if there's a problem, a red flag comes up, you're on the no-fly list, then the airline is informed that you cannot be issued a boarding pass. The no-fly list has really been, I think, a real problem for civil liberties and people who work on those issues, because the no-fly list is one of those sort of gray areas where we're not allowed to know who's on it, we're not allowed to know if we're on it, we're not allowed to know why we're on it, and we are only informed that we are on it when we're trying to take a flight and unable to actually do so. The thing with Real ID is that it really... I think it was the first time that a lot of state lawmakers actually woke up to the reality of the power grab and the usurpation that's been happening by the federal government over things that should, by constitutional definition, be state rights. Janet Napolitano, the head of Homeland Security, the director of Homeland Security, said recently in a news interview that she was okay with the fact that the Real ID had kind of died a natural death, and she wanted to replace it with something called the Pass ID, and that the Pass ID would be modeled after something called an enhanced driver's license. The enhanced driver's license is a driver's license with an RFID tag in it. And what makes it frightening, to me at least as an RFID researcher, is that the Department of Homeland Security and the State Department selected the least secure version of RFID to put into these enhanced driver's licenses. Now, as of right now, November 2009, they are voluntary. They are only being issued in a handful of border states. I know that Homeland Security is approaching the governors and the departments of motor vehicles of all border states. The enhanced driver's licenses right now are being issued by the states of Washington, Michigan, Vermont, New York, and Arizona. So what that means is that those people in those states, if they choose to cross the border from Canada or Mexico and return back home again, a state driver's license is no longer adequate. They're required to have some form of federally issued ID card, and that must contain an RFID tag. Looking at there in the form of the enhanced driver's license is a microchip antenna combination that has a 30 to 60 foot read range, no encryption, no shielding whatsoever, and can be read really by anyone with an RFID reader. Travel is actually one of our inherent rights. It is a natural right, and it's one that should not be infringed by the federal government. I am very concerned about the federal government moving into an arena of requiring ID cards and national ID cards for participation in basic activities.
We are sharing our private information, not only with foreign governments, but private companies. And these companies and governments, our state governments, have a long history of losing that information.
The right to travel and the right to privacy, you might say, are two separate rights. However, our federal government and our state governments have merged them together and essentially act like we don't have either.
It is said that the forces of evil operate through the government, and many in very extreme positions of power in the United Nations, for whatnot, the Bilderbergers Council on Foreign Relations Trilateral Commission, are agents of evil, and they are jealous of the power that your God has. They are not all-knowing, they are not all-powerful, and they are not all-present.
The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. In this sense, it is that your union ought to be considered as the main prop of your liberty. Often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and accordingly to the alternate triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction. In all the changes to which you may be invited, remember that time and habit are at least as necessary to fix the true character of government as of other human institutions. That experience is the surest standard by which to test the real tendency of the existing constitution of a country. The common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of a country are subjected to the policy and will of another. If in the opinions of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution itself designates. But let there be no change by usurpation. For though this in one instant may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. It is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. The rule indeed extends with more or less force to every species of free government. In the execution of such a plan, nothing is more essential than the permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations. The nation which indulges toward another habitual hatred or habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. Antipathy in one nation against another disposes each more readily to offer insult and injury, to lay hold of slight causes of umbrage, and to haughty and intractable, which when accidental or trifling occasions of dispute occur. So likewise a passionate attachment of one nation for another produces a variety of evils. Sympathy for the favorite nation, facilitating the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interest exists, and infusing into the one the enmities of the other, betrays the former into a participation in the quarrels and wars of the latter without adequate inducement or justification. It leads also to concessions to the favorite nation of privilege denied to others, which is apt doubly to injure the nation making the concessions by unnecessarily parting with what ought to have been retained and by exciting jealousy, ill will, and a disposition to retaliate. It gives ambitious, corrupted, or deluded citizens who devote themselves to the favorite nation faculty to betray or sacrifice the interests of their own country without odium, sometimes even with popularity, against the insidious wiles of foreign influence. I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake. That foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of a Republican government. But that jealousy, to be useful, must be impartial, else it becomes the instrument of the very influence to be avoided instead of a defense against it. I am your most humble servant, George Washington.
We do meddle in the internal affairs of foreign countries. We do take sides. We do favor some, and we maintain animosity towards others. This has given us a war on terror, which in turn has produced our developing police state. Our foreign policy does not seem to be serving our general welfare. General Welfare Clause is a clarifying clause. It clarifies each of the powers that are enumerated in Article 1, Section 8, including the power to declare war. How noble the cause. You must follow the rules. The Constitution is a set of principles to govern the government, not to be violated. Giving up any part of our sovereignty, yielding our sovereignty to another country or another body, international body, is a violation of our Constitution.
The emphasis would be on the general, for the general welfare.
Clarifying clause of general welfare in the preamble to the Constitution is the most commonly misunderstood, and I would submit to you, the most commonly abused piece of words that we have in the Constitution.
It was meant to be a restriction on spending, not a license to spend. And because of that misunderstanding, we have now politicians that can buy votes to stay in office. All they have to do is spend money on specific welfare, not general welfare.
The words promote the general welfare should not be confused with providing welfare. It doesn't mean a redistribution of my money to somebody else. It doesn't mean oppressing and captivating a large number of Americans by providing them with the means to exist so they don't have to work.
As the federal government has used the General Welfare Clause to expand its powers greatly, if the General Welfare Clause meant that they can do pretty much anything in general that they thought was good for the welfare, then what was the purpose of writing the whole rest of the Constitution?
The general welfare is best served by strengthening families than by strengthening government. General welfare is neither promoted nor provided for when Congress exceeds the enumerated powers of the Constitution, and that the General Welfare Clause does not provide constitutional justification for mandated or government-run health insurance, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or any other form of welfare payments to individuals.
This country has been under assault and under invasion for at least 25 or 30 years. Former administrations have failed to protect the American public and the national sovereignty and national security of this country. One of the biggest lies that come out of the mouth of those who believe in unfettered, unregulated, unlimited immigration, legal and illegal, but especially illegal, is that illegal immigration is not a crime. Nothing can be further from the truth. There's unlawful entry or entry without inspection or fraud at entry, meaning an individual who comes up to a port of entry and says that they're coming here for 3 weeks to visit their mother are actually coming here to work, and they're lying through their teeth to the immigration officer who's at the port of entry. Alien smuggling and or transporting of illegal aliens, harboring illegal aliens, encouraging or inducing alien to enter the United States or remain illegally or enter illegally, marriage fraud, entrepreneur fraud, unlawful reentry of previously deported felons, and failure to depart. It has been often said that we have a revolving door with our border with Mexico, that as fast as we can send somebody back, they will return. Personally, I've seen individuals and have arrested individuals over the course of my career that I've encountered 3, 4, 5 times, where we've arrested them, deported them, they've come back. Under Title 8 United States Code, Section 1326, any alien who has been deported and who unlawfully reenters commits a federal felony. It used to be that immigration would send out a letter to them, which was derisively called a run letter. And the reason why it was called a run letter was because the letter said, you've been ordered deported, please show up with 44 pounds of baggage to this address on this date and time and be ready to go home. Well, instead of showing up, they ran. There are over 450,000 alien absconders running around the countryside today that have final orders of removal. And what they're doing is they're thumbing their nose at the American government and the American people, telling us, we're not leaving, make us leave. The government of the United States does not actively prosecute all these crimes. They selectively prosecute, and depending on which jurisdiction you're in, they may see more prosecutions of one than another. Our back door, ladies and gentlemen, is wide open. Having an open border not only allows the entry of illegal aliens, but allows for the massive amounts of drugs such as methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, and marijuana to enter the United States. The United States has less than 5% of the world population, yet for some unexplained reason, we consume more than 50% of the world's drug supply. The mass exodus that this country is experiencing from Mexico over the last 10 years is a direct result of the drug war that is plaguing that country. We have been told estimates run from anywhere from 12 to 20 million illegal aliens. I recently saw a figure that somebody actually crunched the numbers and came up with over 42,300,000 plus illegal aliens. If you want to have an idea of what that impact is going to be 10 to 15 years after these people receive amnesty, add a 0 to that number, and that's what will be the increase in the American population. In plain English, 420 million.
Our nation's leaders have, and media have propagated a whole great deal of misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies about the situation in the border. It was really frustrating to me that we were put in a position where we were expected to fail, where the administrations that we served under, and my career spanned 4 administrations, 2 Republican administrations and 2 Democratic administrations, including the current one, and not one thing ever changed throughout the time that I served in the federal government with the mission of defending the United States border and enforcing the immigration laws of the United States. The fact is, we don't stop anybody. 100% of illegal aliens who want to come to this country, they make it. And how do I make such a bold statement? Because the smuggling organizations themselves offer a 100% guarantee for their services. I've arrested illegal aliens from almost every country on the face of this planet. So this isn't about Mexico. This isn't about Canada. This isn't about just one particular geographic area. It's about real enemies of the United States from all over the globe. And when officials say that we're stopping X number of percentage, they're lying to you, because we don't stop anybody. And I know that because in the wee hours of the night on patrol in the Cleveland National Forest of Southern California, 5 or 10 miles away from my posted assignment, north of the border, someplace I wasn't supposed to be, that I actually went there because I responded to a California State Patrol request for assistance. And on the way back to my patrol, the area I was assigned in, I happened upon a group of illegal aliens. And the only reason I found it, I'm going to be quick because I know we're running out of time here, was I saw a little marker on the side of the road and thought, wow, that could be a marker for a smuggling load. And so I stopped and looked around the culvert, and sure enough, there was a group of about 20 illegal aliens. And I was shocked to find that 3 of them were in wheelchairs. And I was like, how in the world did you get here? And they related the story to me, and it was an arduous journey for them. But rest assured, they made it. And only because I happened to be someplace I wouldn't normally have been, I stumbled upon them. So we don't have a border. Everybody makes it in, from the youngest of the young to the oldest of the old. They keep their nose fairly clean and they don't engage in serious criminal misconduct, they stand little to no chance of encountering a man with a federal badge intent on deporting them. Only 100,000 Americans invaded the beaches of Normandy to recapture France from the hands of the Nazis, and that was an invasion. Since whether you're from this side or that side, talking 5 million or 30 million, the common denominator is millions. We're talking millions. That's amazing. And yet we're not speaking about it in the terms of who is not living up to their obligations and their sworn oath under the Constitution to defend this country from that invasion. And that is what it is. It's an invasion.
We are witnessing an invasion in my state, ladies and gentlemen. I cannot fault these people for wanting to get out of the situation where they are. My heart goes out to them. Unfortunately, they're doing the wrong thing.
There are thousands of laws that are not currently being faithfully executed. We need to address the fact that the immigration is not the problem, it's a symptom, it's an exacerbation of other problems. Now, don't think because I'm the delegate from New Hampshire that I'm unfamiliar. I lived in Arizona for over a decade. I know that many hospitals were closed down because they were forced to give free health care to illegal immigrants. That's not an immigrant problem. That's a problem with federal government forcing hospitals to give free health care. You're going to talk about an illegal immigrant standing on the corner selling a dime bag while the CIA is landing planes full of coke at military airports? Let's get real, okay?
Do you open up the doors of your home, the front door, the back door, do you leave them open and unlocked for anyone, anywhere to come into your home and do as they please? That's what you're doing to America.
It's not illegal immigration, it's invasion. We're being invaded not only by the southern border, but also by the northern borders. The biggest problem is we need to end prohibition. It didn't work in the 20s with alcohol. It's not going to work now, and it doesn't.
Our citizens within our borders do have the right to travel freely without being harassed, without being asked, papers, please, as they're going about their business within their own country.
It's costing us hundreds of billions of dollars to educate, feed, house, and medicate the illegal aliens that are coming into this country.
The cartels are actually trying to establish their own sovereignty over our soil.
And we got to get under control. And this is the most egregious we have going on. Our fellow citizens are dying from this.
More than 80% of the American people have demanded something be done to secure the borders. Yet the Bush administration fought efforts to close the border. President Bush demanded that the Senate pass the amnesty bill, even after Capitol Hill was flooded with calls and letters opposing the bill 4 times. Why? Because of agreements made for open borders in the SPP. The term which SPP proponents use is harmonizing our borders into one seamless entity called North America. SPP is neither a treaty nor a formal agreement. Rather, it is a dialogue launched by the heads of state of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And then he asks, what is a dialogue? Well, we don't know. What we do know, however, is that congressional oversight of what might be one of the most significant developments in recent history is non-existent. There is no congressional role in this dialogue. It's no accident that the SPP is working out of the NAFTA office in the Department of Commerce. The North American Free Trade Agreement was a precursor to the Security and Prosperity Partnership. The Bush administration used NAFTA as its excuse or its authorization for implementing the SPP. So NAFTA, then, is basically the governing entity of the SPP. That means NAFTA regulations and ultimately SPP regulations will supersede U.S. laws. NAFTA courts and ultimately SPP courts will overrule U.S. courts. And NAFTA policy and ultimately SPP policy will override U.S. labor, energy, environment, health, and economic policies. NAFTA was the first step in creating a North American Union. It was sold as a means to enhance trade among the American nations. All were promised greater exports, better jobs, and better wages. In truth, NAFTA is an unmitigated failure for all but a very few. Who benefits most from the creation of such a union? Multinational corporations. It is important to note that in addition to the high-level government officials involved in the SPP, sitting at the table as equal partners were representatives of such global corporations as Lockheed Martin, Chevron, and the Canadian Pacific Railway, and a whole slew of others. They are the driving force behind its creation. They seek one currency, one set of rules, one controlling entity to enable them to move goods and services effortlessly across the border. These elite corporations, in partnership with government, gain the power of government, such as eminent domain. They get special tax advantages and other perks not available to their competition. Non-compete clauses in the contracts give the private companies the power to charge whatever they want to travel on their highways. If you have no other roads to drive on, what would be your alternative but to pay whatever they want to charge? The major example of how public-private partnerships work to enforce policy is the planned NAFTA superhighway. It would bisect Texas from its border with Mexico to Oklahoma, and then travel all the way to the Canadian border through Minnesota. This massive highway will be 1/4 of a mile wide, with car lanes, truck lanes, rail lines, utility corridors for natural gas, water, oil, and power lines running down the middle. Now, when I would hear that this was 1/4 of a mile wide, it was hard to picture what that was until someone else gave me the picture. A 12-lane highway, you've seen a 12-lane highway and how wide that is. That's 300 yards. This is 1,200 yards. That's how huge this thing is. It is designed to move containers loaded in foreign lands, particularly in China, which arrive in Mexican ports, there to be loaded on trucks and shipped up the NAFTA corridor through the U.S. and into Canada. The borders would be little more than speed bumps. Trucks would not be stopped and inspected, no drug-sniffing dogs, no doors open to find cargoes of illegal aliens or terrorists. Instead, they would be simply scanned by high-tech gamma ray and RFID screening as the trucks roar over the border. The NAFTA corridor will be a completely separate highway, a toll road run by a foreign corporation. The state of Texas has signed a 50-year lease with a Spanish company named Cintra. Under that contract, this private company is to build the highway, run it, and collect the tolls. The corridor is so wide that it will literally divide the state in two. There are very few overpasses that are planned to cross it, yet it will be impossible to cross without them. Communities that now depend on traffic from existing highways for such services as restaurants and gas stations and hotels will lose that business. Instead, Cintra will establish gas and food facilities down the center of the corridor and control that business and add to its profits. Mexican ports, such as Lázaro Cárdenas, will be teeming with ships loading and unloading, ships mostly coming from communist China. The Mexican trucks continue to roll over the U.S. border. Beginning at the southern tip of Mexico, passing through Laredo, Texas, the highway heads to an inland port in Kansas City, where again, Savvy Networks' Sentry system will electronically inspect the cargoes before they head east or west or continue north through Duluth, Minnesota, and into Canada. Obama has rebranded and refocused the Security and Prosperity Partnership into a new title, North American Leaders Summit. Many Americans simply do not believe that the United States would voluntarily give up its sovereignty to a North American Union. Those who think this way naively believe that there will be a vote by the American people to decide. The North American Free Trade Agreement was sold as a way for American producers to broaden their markets. So too was the European Union sold to the proud ancient nations of that continent. Today, in Europe, a new socialist government rules them, complete with a ruling body, a new currency, a tax system, a court system, and a defense system, all the ingredients necessary for a government. The SPP working groups are efficiently laying down the groundwork for a drastic change in the United States of America, away from our independent, sovereign nation to a form of corporate fascism non-responsive to the will of the people. Once the North American Union is in place, we will then have to compromise our very unique nation of protected freedoms with the socialist nation of Mexico and with Canada, a satellite of the British Crown. We're not bringing them up, we're bringing us down. The SPP is about creating a continental government which would eventually contain its own court system, its own ability to collect taxes, including some sort of military or police force, and its own currency, and its own governing body. The SPP is an invasion of our culture and our economy. It's about the redistribution of American wealth and industry, and it will represent the end of over 250 years of a historic experiment in freedom unless Americans across the nation say no now.
It is our duty to resist it.
I think civil disobedience is something that definitely needs to have another rise here in the American history, because it's part of our culture, it's part of our heritage, it's part of the liberty development. And I think a strong declaration of non-authority telling everybody, hey, you guys are overstepping your bounds, we know that you are, and we refuse to participate, we refuse to comply. I think it sends a very strong message not only to the man but also to our fellow Americans.
Passive resistance, just simply not complying. That is what will get government's attention.
No matter what race, no matter what religion you are, we're all in the same boat and it's sinking. We need unity now. I personally feel if we don't learn to get along and become one people in the very near future, y'all, we ain't going to be a people much longer.
All sovereignty originates with the Creator and is gifted to the individual, from where it is delegated to the family to the state to the nation. Any corruption of this order violates natural law and the God-given rights of the people. History has shown us that the further away from the people that governments are, the more corrupt and oppressive they become.
And either I am what I claim to be, a free individual under God, or I'm a liar.
It is a basic, fundamental principle that we must understand and convey to the people in this nation, that when a government acts contrary to the reason that we created them, they do, in fact, forfeit their authority.
Once again, my rights come from my Creator, not from the Constitution.
The purpose of government is to join together to unite for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberty, and estate, which I call by the general name property. The great and chief end, therefore, of men uniting into commonwealths, putting themselves under government, is the preservation of their property. And there were many, many things written at that particular point in time highlighting the critical importance of having private property independent of the government. The Fifth Amendment, no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself or to be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. That concept of public use was for roads, federal highways, courts, federal buildings, that sort of thing. That's what the public use was for. It was not for the public good, which is turned into be now. The central purpose of government is to protect an individual's private property, unless, of course, his use of that property infringed on somebody else's rights. If you look at what our economy is presently made up of, 70% of all small businesses in the United States are started with equity loans on personal homes. Why? Because we can go get a loan, equity loan on our house for $30,000 or $40,000, $50,000 to start a business. If you look at the average income for Americans, it's $45,000 a year. If you look at it for the socialist Europeans, that's $34,000 a year. That's the cost, basically, of socialism. The former communist nations that did not have private property rights, they have an average income now of only $2,000 a year. It is shocking to see how important private property rights are. And our founding fathers understood this very clearly, and that's why they set up the protections of private property the way they did. During the 1960s and early 1970s, the various Rockefeller foundations, and this is primarily, you can trace it right back to these Rockefeller foundations, sponsored a host of studies designed to destroy private property rights and institute state control over those rights. Out of these came the EPA, the Clean Air Act, the National Environmental Protection Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. Various federal land use control bills were tried to be passed in the 1970 to 75 period, but they failed. There was enough intelligence left in Congress to stop at least that. But smart growth is supposed to be the solution to all the problems in urban areas. It's what's been happening in rural areas imposed in urban areas. It's supposedly the smart thing to do. Urban growth boundaries. This is in Portland. This is the first city that actually did this in a major way back in the 1970s and 80s. And what they've done is basically drawn a line around the city at which the city is going to grow and grow no further. If you happen to have rural land within those bounds, your land values go from $6,000 to $10,000 an acre up to $100,000 to $150,000 overnight. This is what happened in 1984 to 1998 in housing prices in Portland. The real mean family income remained fairly constant. It actually declined a little bit, while the real housing prices increased by about 125% during that period of time. They're actually much more than that right now because it never ends. It keeps getting more and more expensive. We need, first of all, to get rid of the Department of Education because all they're doing is indoctrinating our kids. We must emphasize the need for real constitutional studies in public education, including the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. We must reverse any law implementing sustainable development or Rousseau-type control. That's just totally anti-constitution. And rewrite environmental laws to protect private property rights limited only by historic harm and nuisance provisions of common law right since the days of the Magna Carta. And finally, strengthen the 5th and the 14th Amendment, not by constitutional amendment. We don't want an amendment process. That opens us up to too much danger. But requiring government at all levels to pay just compensation for regulatory takings as well as total takings.
We all know that America is changing. I'm not talking about straightforward changes happening in town or the improvements to rangeland. I'm talking about the change from the land of the free and the home of the brave to the land of the collected and home of the enslaved. After careful study, I have learned that many of the crazy policies that we see being implemented here and all over the globe mirror an international program called the United Nations Agenda 21. Now, that's the agenda for the 21st century, also known as sustainable development. Now, sustainable development is designed to change our political system and the American society. Its programs affect our homes, our property, our families, natural resources, neighborhoods, schools, water supply, finances, health care, and liberty itself. ICLEI stands for the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. ICLEI is a non-governmental organization. It is located on every continent. It is dedicated, in its own words, to the implementation of sustainable development. ICLEI influences local jurisdictions through the use of incentives to adopt international policies in the name of climate change. Now, ICLEI is a partner with local jurisdictions in building a one-world system of governance. Agenda 21 serves as the guidebook for the implementation of sustainable development, which, after careful study, reveals that sustainable development is a code word for world government operating at the local level. The most blatant example of the UN's assumption of control over vast tracts of American land is evidenced by a long list of United Nations protected areas that are managed by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. The mission of the IUCN is to, quote, influence, encourage, and assist societies throughout the world to conserve the integrity and diversity of nature, and to ensure that any use of natural resources is equitable and ecologically sustainable. The Wildlands Network helps the IUCN create and implement policies and legislations that promote the massive land grabs going on in America. Conservation easements are promoted by the ICUN to aid in the fulfillment of the wildlands objective. The effort to take American land away from American citizens on the acre-by-acre basis, as proclaimed by the Wildlands Network, reminds me of the mentality behind the Wildlands Project. Sustainable business councils are being formed. Their purpose is to promote the so-called public-private partnership. Affordable housing is a typical output coming from these business councils. Affordable housing is government housing. Affordable housing is constructed in communities across this country by combining taxpayer resources with nonprofit builders chosen by cities to partner with the city in creating smart growth development or other New World types of development. Agenda 21 is the globalist political program for the 21st century. It has three broad and written objectives. The first is the step-by-step abolition of private property. Let us count the ways. Eminent domain, including the infamous Kelo decision from several years ago, negates a property owner's unalienable right to the continuing use of his property. Now, the second broad written objective for Agenda 21 is education for global citizenship, which means the ideal protected by the political recognition of unalienable rights is to be forgotten by current and succeeding generations. Children are now being trained as global citizens without awareness of the American promise. Control over human action, evidenced by forced vaccinations. This is the third broad objective. Agenda 21, Sustainable Development, has infiltrated all of America. We as Americans need to act locally, recapture our national government, and continue the pursuit of individual liberty for each and every American citizen.
Did you know that in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 specifies that the federal government should own no other property except for 10 miles square and only property for the purpose of common defense by the consent of the states.
The responsibility of government is to secure to its citizens the fruit of their labor, which is their property, and the opportunity to utilize that property as capital to create wealth.
Liberty is founded on property rights. You own yourself, and through your right to the land that you have and the work that you have done, the sweat of your brow and your labor, you create your property and from that property your wealth.
Our due process rights demand that before our property is seized, that the government has taken us to court and allowed us due process. Without a federal court order, a lien or a levy are not lawful. They cannot be honored by the recipient.
We have to communicate with our fellow Americans. We have to do that. And if we don't, it's going to be a tough one. This represents the government of the United States of America. This is this is the threat. As long as that critter's running loose out here, we're threatened. We, the people, are down here. We're here, and this monster is above us. When I finish here this morning, I want we, the people, to be up here. They, in that government school, they told us that we control that monster, of course, with our votes on election day. We have learned to our sorrow that the election process just doesn't do it, does it? Where is this government? Where is it getting the consent to do what they're doing today? The election process that they told us about has been so compromised, it has been so corrupted. We have to put some more bars on this cage. The elections just don't do it. The grand juries go way back prior to Magna Carta, the principle. The Magna Carta came, of course, in 1215 AD. The grand jury has become nothing in our system today simply because the people sitting on that grand jury don't know the truth. You know, that television set in your home, that is there, and it is the channel through which all of these lies that we have become so accustomed to. And it has gotten so bad that now people would rather hear the lie than the truth. Any grand jury in this country can sit down and they can put a subpoena on Obama and order him to appear before the grand jury and bring his birth certificate with him. A grand jury is a grand jury, and it is made up of we the people. And so we'll put this one more bar up here. The trial jury. When you put the grand jury and the petit jury, the trial jury, back into business, an educated jury, it makes a monster big difference. Patriotism. 9/11, everybody was flying the flag, and they thought they were patriotic. True patriotism is where the people give their allegiance to their country. False patriotism is where people give their allegiance to government. We've had this same mental problem that has caused so many wars and so much death and so much misery. We have people out there today that believe that if this government goes, the whole country's gone. When I got into this war, I was reminded of what I was taught in my high school biology class. And they discovered that if you had a flock of chickens out there in the barnyard, there was one boss chicken. And there was a chicken that was on the bottom of the society, the chicken society. And I got to thinking about this, that every governmental system will always have a pecking order. And so I set about putting together this thing, and I put God's law at the top. The greatest lawgiver and his law is supreme. God's law is up here at the top, and then the laws of common sense